Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Laura, I'm from Spain and I'm currently pursuing a master's degree in international conflict studies at King's College London. When I came across the opportunity of doing an internship at A4R Refugees through my department, the Department of War Studies, I really liked their focus on post-conflict communities and how societies rebuild or sometimes struggle to rebuild after violence. I feel like we always focus on active conflicts and forget about them when they are over, but societies rarely go back to what they were after a conflict. The social, economic, and psychological consequences of violence continue long after peace agreements are signed. That's why I believe it is important to give voice to these stories and not to forget that many people in post-conflict situations are still suffering, even when it's no longer headline news. I also like that A4R Refugees gives space to GenZ voices to reflect critically on post-conflict societies, especially in the polarized world we live in today, and that half of their profits go directly to post-conflict communities. So, in my article, I focus on how Postmemory is articulated in post-apartheid South Africa. I have enjoyed researching about this because, well, first of all, I've never reflected on how post-memory affects societies marked by past conflict-related trauma. And second of all, because I haven't really learned much about South Africa during my undergraduate or postgraduate studies, even though the country is still experiencing the effects of apartheid. So the reason why I picked this topic is because in one of my modules on colonialism, we had to read an article by Nigel Gibson offering a Fanonian perspective on post-apartheid South Africa. And just for some clarity, Fanonian comes from Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist, philosopher, and decolonial scholar who was interested in racism and colonialism as a political and economic reality and on how colonialism impacts in the psyche of the colonized. He believed that neoliberal restructuring of post-colonial countries replicates forms of direct colonial domination. So then this Fanonian perspective on South Africa, on post-apartheid South Africa, made me ask myself a question. So if apartheid officially ended in 1994, why does inequality still look so familiar? In this article and podcast, I explore post-memory in post-apartheid South Africa and how freedom can exist in law but not always in lived reality. So let's go back for a moment. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections in which Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress came to power. Apartheid, which was a system of racial segregation established in 1948, was then legally dismantled. Archbishop Desmond Tutu called the country the Rainbow Nation, which was a vision of unity, diversity, and justice. The new constitution was progressive and political rights were extended to all citizens. But more than 30 years later, South Africa remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. Just to give you some data, 10% of the population controls 80% of the wealth. In early 2023, black unemployment was around 40% compared to 7.5% among white South Africans. The wage difference between white and black households is more than $5,000 per month. Townships created under apartheid still exist and are expanding. Gross debt reached 71% of the GDP in 2022 due to corruption and government inefficiency, and public schools lack resources and face persistent racism. So the question is, what has exactly changed? Well, here's where post-memory comes into play. When we talk about post-memory, we usually think of stories passed down by our parents or grandparents. In South Africa, though, post-memory is not just narrative. It is also passed down through space, inequality, and daily limits. It is lived. Young people, the so-called born-free generation born after 1994, didn't live apartheid, but apartheid still lives where they can live, study, and work. So they inherit not only the memory of apartheid, but the structures through which its divisions continue. Segregated towns, unequal education systems, concentrated wealth, and limited economic mobility. In this sense, economic and spatial inequality become a material form of post-memory. To understand all of this more deeply, we need to return to the 1955 Freedom Charter, which promised economic redistribution, equal education, freedom to live where you choose, and dignity and justice for all. At its heart were three fundamental human needs: justice, freedom, and autonomy. But what happened after 1994? Well, Gibson argues that the transition from an apartheid system to a democratic country involved an elite pact between corporate capital and the African National Congress. So instead of redistribution, South Africa adopted neoliberal economic policies. This in turn created a black economic empowerment that gave birth to a new black elite, but that did not fundamentally transform the economic structure. It just created opportunities for some. So justice didn't reach everyone. Freedom became symbolic because everyone can vote, move, and participate politically. But if economic survival is uncertain and spatial segregation continues, freedom becomes symbolic rather than substantive. And autonomy, which is the ability to shape one's own life, remained constrained by space because cities were deracialized, but only for those who could afford access, this new elite, while poor black South Africans continue to live in townships located far from the economic centers. As the decolonialist scholar Frantz Fanon wrote, colonial domination is inscribed in the geography of society, and in post-apartheid South Africa, space still divides populations. But postmemory here is not only about inherited poverty, it is also about inherited expectation of the promised land, which is the vision of South Africa embodied in the Freedom Charter. This promised land was based on the idea that liberation would bring material transformation. The born free generation was promised an equal and just country where everyone has access to the same opportunities regardless of skin color. So when that promise feels unfulfilled, hope can turn into anger and frustration. This is what Gibson calls an incomplete liberation. And sometimes this frustration is redirected. For example, the xenophobic violence of 2008 targeted poor African migrants, the so-called black foreigners, rather than economic elites or political leaders. So even if freedom exists in theory, for me it feels symbolical rather than real. So I would like you to take away three key central ideas from all of this. First, apartheid ended legally, but its spatial and economic structures persist. Second, postmemory in South Africa is not only transmitted through stories, but through lived inequality. And third, the Freedom Charter's promise of justice, freedom, and autonomy remains an unfinished project. 3 decades after the term Rainbow Nation was coined, the ideal remains aspirational. The born-free generation did not experience apartheid directly, but they inherit its afterlives, spatial divisions, economic exclusion, and the expectation of justice yet to come. Black South Africans still suffer discrimination in their day-to-day lives, and it may feel as if the ghost of apartheid is still present. Because there is something very disorienting about growing up in a country that tells you that you are free, while your neighborhood, your school, and your economic opportunities suggest otherwise. This tension between narrative and experience is where postmemory becomes powerful. It is not just about what people remember, but what they were promised and what they actually inherit. So again, the question that remains, at least for me, is: can a society be legally free but materially constrained? If you found this episode interesting, please share it because it really helps. And if you are interested in post-conflict societies, stay tuned for more stories. Thank you so much for listening.